Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're jumping right into a 3,000-year-old mystery that honestly looks a lot like a massive civilization-ending crime scene. We're talking about one of the most sudden and absolute societal collapses in human history, the end of the Bronze Age. Think of the Bronze Age as the ancient equivalent of our modern hyper-connected global economy. And right at the center of its violent, messy collapse is a group known only as the Sea Peoples. So we're going to look closely at the evidence, break down this ancient crime scene, and try to figure out how an interconnected world of incredibly advanced empires just vanished. Picture a thriving world suddenly going dark, literally empire by empire. For years, the mighty Egyptian empire had watched its neighbors just disappear. The great kings of the Hittites up in modern-day Turkey, who used to exchange these lavish gifts and ambassadors with Egypt, they just stopped writing. First, there were rumors. Then, desperate refugees started showing up, and then, total silence. The merchant ships stopped coming, and the vast trade routes connecting three continents began to completely collapse. Kingdoms were falling silent, domino by domino, until finally, right around 1177 BC, it was Egypt's turn to face the music. Now, Pharaoh Ramesses III knew exactly what was at stake here. If these invaders breached the fertile Nile Valley, Egypt itself was going to disappear just like all its neighbors. But Ramesses didn't panic. And crucially, he didn't wait to meet the enemy out on the open sea. Instead, he ingeniously ambushed the invading fleet by basically turning the Nile Delta into a deadly trap. He let the enemy fleet sail right into the narrow, choked-up waterways of the river channels. And once they were completely bottlenecked and couldn't maneuver, Egyptian ships popped out of hiding, and archers lining the riverbanks just unleashed devastating volleys from every single direction. We actually know all of this because of some incredibly dramatic eyewitness testimony left by the pharaoh himself. After the dust settled, Ramses III carved his account of the battle onto the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. The inscription ominously reads, "The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands." It paints this terrifying picture of a coordinated, malicious force rising up from the sea, a literal wave of destruction that Ramses claims swept through all those powerful kingdoms before finally landing on his doorstep. And he didn't just leave us with vague descriptions either. He literally carved the names of the attackers into the stone. This was a massive, terrifying coalition, and the records named several distinct groups: the Peliset, the Jeker, the Shekelesh, the Denenian, and the Weshesh. By naming them, the Egyptians were documenting a multi-layered alliance. But when we look at these names today, well, they leave us with way more questions than answers. Who actually were these people? And where in the world were their mysterious islands or homelands? But, right, here's the catch with all of this. Everything we know about this massive invasion comes almost entirely from Egyptian sources, and historians absolutely do not view these carvings as, objective truth. The Egyptians basically had the ancient world's best PR team. Royal inscriptions were kind of like the Instagram filters of antiquity. They were strictly meant to celebrate the pharaoh and project absolute strength to secure his legacy. Now, that doesn't mean the battle was fake. Historians totally agree Egypt repelled a major invasion. But it does mean we're getting the story exactly as Egypt wanted future generations to see it. We're watching the highlight reel, not the unedited security footage. But wait, if you look really closely at the background of those exact same heroic carvings, you start spotting hidden clues. Right there, amidst the colliding ships and falling warriors, the artists actually carved ox carts, they carved women, children, even household possessions, which completely changes the context of the whole event. If these carvings accurately reflect reality, this wasn't just some standard military invasion launched by a professional army. It actually looked like a massive, desperate migration of entire families on the move. So the million-dollar question is, who were they, really? Were they brutal pirates out to plunder the rich cities of the Mediterranean? Desperate families just looking for a new home following their warriors? Or, something else entirely? Since historians have debated this exact question for generations, we can categorize the leading suspects into three main profiles. We're going to walk through the core theory for each, look at the archaeological and historical evidence backing them up, and highlight what parts are still, frankly, pure speculation. This framework is exactly what you should take away from this explainer to really wrap your head around the complexity of the Bronze Age collapse. Okay, let's dive right into Theory 1, which is actually one of the strongest among modern historians right now. The Sea Peoples were desperate refugees fleeing an unprecedented environmental disaster. I mean, imagine your homeland facing years of relentless, crushing drought. You aren't packing up to conquer new lands, you're leaving because staying means you're going to starve. In this light, the people clashing with the Egyptian army weren't the masterminds of some grand conspiracy. They were just victims of a rapidly changing world, trying to survive. And the evidence supporting this is incredibly compelling. Modern climate and archaeological data prove that the Eastern Mediterranean was under severe, prolonged environmental stress. Step 1, brutal droughts and massive earthquakes just hammered the region. Step 2, this directly caused widespread harvest failures, which then triggered the total collapse of the intricate trade networks everyone relied on. Step 3, staying put just becomes impossible, forcing these mass migrations for survival. It perfectly explains those ox carts and families in the Egyptian carvings. If this is true, the Sea Peoples didn't cause the collapse of the Bronze Age, they were literally running from it. But hold on, what if they weren't victims at all? What if they were ambitious warriors just exploiting the collapse? Theory 2 suggests that as these great empires started weakening from internal drama or natural disasters, their coastal cities and loaded trade ships became incredibly easy, lucrative targets. Professional warriors saw a golden opportunity to get rich quick through plunder, taking full advantage of the sudden vulnerability of these once untouchable superpowers. The evidence for this points to a profile that looks a whole lot like ancient Vikings. These groups were incredibly fast and highly mobile, and they didn't just raid undefended little villages. They successfully attacked heavily fortified cities, which, requires serious military organization, planning, and real siege experience. Plus, some of these groups show up repeatedly in Egyptian military records over several decades. You definitely don't manage to repeatedly harass the greatest military power of the age for decades unless you're a highly organized, lethal fighting force. Then we have Theory 3, which poses a fascinating, almost poetic idea. What if these mysterious invaders weren't actually outsiders from some distant, unknown lands? What if they were survivors from the very empires that had just fallen? Imagine your king dies, your government completely collapses, and your palace burns to the ground. If your family escapes the ruins by sea, looking for safe harbor on foreign shores, well, would history remember you as a tragic refugee or as a hostile invader? A lot of scholars suspect that these groups might have been displaced citizens from the collapsed governments of the Aegean or Western Anatolia, so areas around modern-day Greece and Turkey. There are these tantalizing, although admittedly heavily debated links between the names of certain Sea Peoples groups and those specific regions. These were folks whose entire way of life had shattered almost overnight, taking to their ships to find a new home in the few places, like Egypt, that were actually still standing. Ultimately, to really wrap our heads around this mystery, we have to remember one absolutely vital detail. The Sea Peoples is entirely a modern catch-all term. It was coined way later, in the 19th century. The Egyptians never once called them that. They listed specific, individual tribes. Using Sea Peoples is honestly a bit like calling everyone who lives on land the Land Peoples. It doesn't exactly narrow down the suspect list, right? But using this one umbrella term, we might actually be sabotaging our own investigation, lumping together completely different groups of starving refugees, opportunistic pirates, and displaced survivors into one giant confusing pile. Because the hard truth is this. Despite centuries of intense archaeological digging and historical research, there is absolutely no scholarly consensus on their exact origins. None. If you ever see someone claiming they know precisely where the Sea Peoples came from for sure, they are vastly overstating the evidence. The clues are scattered, the ancient sources are super biased, and the timeline is a complete mess. Ramesses III did win his battle, and Egypt lived to see another day. But that interconnected, prosperous world that had thrived before the Sea Peoples, it was gone forever, completely plunged into a dark age. And this leaves us with one final haunting question about the greatest unsolved mystery of the ancient world. Did the Sea Peoples actually destroy the Bronze Age, or were they simply the final violent symptom of a civilization that was already collapsing from within? It's a question that really forces us to look at how quickly our own hyper-connected world could unravel. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the past.